For centuries, Europeans described the Ottoman Empire as an unstoppable threat at the gates of their civilization. Yet the deeper paradox is this: the Ottoman state did not rise by destroying Europe alone, but by becoming deeply entangled with it, trading with it, learning from it, and sometimes even stabilizing it. The empire that terrified Europe was also part of the same political system that allowed European powers to survive their own endless rivalries. Wars lasted generations, borders shifted slowly, and neither side ever truly erased the other. So the question is not simply how the Ottomans fought Europe for so long, but why a conflict that seemed existential for both sides never actually ended the struggle. Long before the Ottoman Empire became a power feared across Europe, it began as something far smaller and far more uncertain, a frontier principality on the edge of a fractured world. To understand why the Ottomans would spend centuries fighting European powers, it is necessary to begin in a landscape where empires had already weakened, borders were unstable, and authority often existed only where someone had the strength to enforce it. The origins of the Ottoman state lie in Anatolia during the late 13th century, a region that had once been dominated by the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, but had slowly broken apart after the Mongol invasions of the mid-1200s. By the time the Ottoman dynasty first appears clearly in historical records, Anatolia was no longer governed by a single strong state. Instead, it was divided among dozens of small Turkish principalities known as beyliks, each ruled by local warlords who competed for land, prestige, and followers. These beyliks emerged from the collapse of Seljuk authority and from the shifting political order created after the Mongol conquest of much of the Middle East. The Mongols did not directly rule every village or fortress in Anatolia, but their dominance weakened the older institutions that had once kept the region unified. As central authority faded, ambitious military leaders established their own domains, forming small states that were often little more than fortified towns surrounded by contested countryside. Among these frontier rulers was a leader remembered in Ottoman tradition as Osman, the figure from whom the dynasty would eventually take its name. Modern historians still debate the precise details of Osman's early life, but surviving Byzantine and later Ottoman sources agree on one important point: his territory lay along the border between the Muslim Turkish principalities of Anatolia and the Christian lands of the Byzantine Empire. This border region, sometimes described by historians as a frontier zone, was not a quiet boundary between stable states. It was a place where raids, alliances, betrayals, and small battles occurred regularly. Local warriors, often motivated by promises of land or plunder, gathered around leaders who could offer both protection and opportunity. In this environment, loyalty was flexible, and power depended less on inherited legitimacy than on the ability to attract followers and win victories. The small Ottoman beylik began in precisely this world of frontier competition. It did not initially possess great cities, large bureaucracies, or vast armies. What it possessed instead was a strategic position near Byzantine territories in northwestern Anatolia, particularly around the region of Bithynia. From this frontier, Ottoman warriors participated in raids against nearby Byzantine settlements, a pattern of conflict that had been common along the border for generations. These early raids were not yet part of a grand imperial strategy to conquer Europe. They were typical frontier warfare, driven by the economic realities of the time. Successful raids brought livestock, goods, and sometimes new land. For small frontier states, such victories were essential for survival. The frontier environment also created a unique cultural atmosphere in which different traditions mixed. Turkish nomadic heritage, Islamic religious ideas, and the long administrative traditions of the Byzantine world all existed within relatively close proximity. Merchants traveled through the region, soldiers shifted between rulers, and local populations often included both Muslims and Christians living under changing authorities. This environment would shape the early Ottoman state in ways that became crucial to its later expansion toward Europe. The Ottoman polity was born in a place where the boundary between two civilizations was not a rigid wall but a constantly shifting zone of contact, conflict, and adaptation. Life along the Anatolian Byzantine frontier during the late 13th and early 14th centuries was shaped by a constant sense of movement and uncertainty. The borders that appear clearly on modern maps did not exist in the same rigid form at that time. Instead, the frontier was a wide zone where political control could shift from year to year depending on which local ruler had the stronger army or the more loyal followers. Villages sometimes paid taxes to one authority one year and another the next. Fortresses guarded trade routes, but they also served as bases for raids. In this unstable environment, communities adapted to a rhythm of life in which warfare was not an occasional crisis, but a regular part of the political landscape. The early Ottoman state grew inside this frontier culture, and understanding that culture helps explain why the Ottomans developed into a military power that would later confront European states for centuries. Many of the warriors who gathered under frontier leaders were known in later sources as ghazis. The word is often associated with fighters who believed they were participating in a religious struggle, but the reality of frontier warfare was more complex. Some warriors certainly saw their campaigns against Byzantine territories as a form of religious duty, inspired by the idea of expanding lands ruled by Muslims. At the same time, economic opportunity played a powerful role. Successful raids could provide livestock, grain, metal goods, and captives who might be ransomed or incorporated into local communities. For men living in a frontier environment with limited farmland and uncertain security, joining a successful war leader could offer a path to both wealth and social status. The attraction of plunder, land, and reputation often worked together with religious motivations rather than replacing them. The Ottoman leaders, beginning with Osman and continuing with his successors, appear to have understood this frontier mentality very well. Their authority depended on attracting capable warriors and maintaining their loyalty. Victory in raids and small campaigns brought new followers, while defeat could cause a leader's coalition to fragment quickly. Because of this, early Ottoman expansion followed a pattern typical of frontier polities: gradual pressure on nearby territories combined with opportunistic alliances. Local Byzantine governors sometimes negotiated truces or even cooperated with Turkish rulers when it suited their interests. The frontier was therefore not a simple line dividing enemies, but a region where diplomacy, trade, and warfare all existed together. Another important feature of this frontier society was its mixture of populations: Greek-speaking Christian villagers, Turkish pastoral groups, merchants traveling through Anatolia, and administrators connected to the fading Byzantine state, all lived within the same broad region. When the Ottomans gained control of a town or rural district, they did not necessarily replace the existing population. Instead, they often incorporated local communities into their growing domain, while allowing many social and economic practices to continue. Farmers continued cultivating fields, craftsmen continued producing goods, and trade routes continued operating. Maintaining stability in newly controlled territories helped ensure that the Ottoman rulers could collect revenue and support further campaigns. This environment also encouraged flexibility in governance. The early Ottoman polity was not yet a centralized empire with a large bureaucracy. Authority was personal and military in nature, centered on the household of the ruling dynasty and the network of warriors loyal to it. Leaders rewarded supporters with land revenues or positions of influence, creating a system in which military service and political power were closely connected. Over time, these arrangements would evolve into more formal institutions, but in the early period they reflected the practical realities of frontier politics. The significance of this frontier society becomes clearer when considering the long conflict between the Ottoman state and European powers. The Ottomans were shaped from the beginning by a culture that expected continuous border warfare. Expansion was not a sudden decision made by a powerful empire. It was the natural outcome of a frontier system in which success depended on pushing outward whenever opportunities appeared. The same patterns that first brought Ottoman warriors into Byzantine territories in Anatolia would soon carry them across the narrow straits separating Asia from Europe. During the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Ottoman Principality was only one of many Turkish beyliks scattered across Anatolia. States such as the Karamanids, Germanids, and Idinids often controlled larger territories or possessed greater wealth at different moments. Nothing in the earliest years of Ottoman history guaranteed that this small frontier polity would become the empire that later dominated southeastern Europe. For historians, one of the central questions of this period is therefore simple but important. Why did the Ottomans survive and expand while many neighboring principalities eventually disappeared or were absorbed by stronger rivals? One reason lies in geography. The Ottoman domain developed in northwestern Anatolia, close to the weakening Byzantine provinces around the Sea of Marmara. Unlike many other Turkish principalities located deeper inside Anatolia, the Ottomans faced a frontier where the political structure of their main opponent had already begun to crumble. The Byzantine Empire, once the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean, had been weakened by internal conflicts, economic strain, and the long consequences of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. When Crusaders captured Constantinople and fragmented imperial authority, by the time Ottoman rulers began consolidating power, Byzantine control over much of western Anatolia had already become fragile. Fortresses remained, and local governors still represented imperial authority, but the empire no longer possessed the military strength required to defend every frontier settlement effectively. This situation created opportunities that frontier leaders like Osman and his successors could exploit gradually. Instead of confronting a strong, centralized opponent, the Ottomans encountered isolated garrisons and towns that often had to defend themselves with limited support. Some cities resisted fiercely, while others negotiated arrangements that allowed them to continue functioning under new political masters. Expansion, in this context, did not always require massive armies. A combination of pressure, negotiation, and occasional sieges slowly extended Ottoman influence across the region. Over time, these small gains accumulated into a more stable territorial base. Leadership also played a role. Early Ottoman rulers appear to have been particularly effective at maintaining alliances and loyalty among frontier warriors. Their courts attracted soldiers, adventurers, and administrators from different backgrounds. Turkish tribal fighters joined alongside converts from Christian communities, while local elites sometimes cooperated with the new rulers in order to preserve their positions. This ability to incorporate diverse groups into a single political structure strengthened the Ottoman Principality and increased its pool of manpower. Rather than relying solely on one tribe or ethnic group, the emerging Ottoman state developed a broader coalition of supporters. Equally important was the gradual transformation from a loose frontier coalition into a more organized political system. As Ottoman territory expanded, rulers began establishing firmer administrative practices. Land revenues were assigned to loyal military followers, helping to ensure that soldiers remained connected to the state and ready for future campaigns. Towns captured from Byzantine control continued functioning as economic centers, providing tax income and supporting trade routes that linked Anatolia to the wider eastern Mediterranean. These developments allowed the Ottoman leadership to maintain momentum without losing stability in newly acquired lands. By the early 14th century, the Ottoman Principality had therefore acquired several advantages that many rival beyliks lacked: a frontier facing a weakened imperial neighbor, a leadership capable of attracting diverse supporters, and a gradually strengthening political structure that could sustain expansion. None of these factors alone explains the later rise of the Ottoman Empire. Together, however, they created conditions in which a small frontier state could grow steadily stronger, while others remained limited by geography or internal divisions. From this foundation, the next stage of Ottoman history would bring an even more significant transformation. The frontier that had shaped the early Ottoman state did not end at the coastline of Anatolia. Just across the narrow waters of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus lay the Balkan Peninsula, a region divided among competing Christian kingdoms and weakened Byzantine territories. When Ottoman forces eventually crossed into Europe in the 14th century, they entered a political landscape that in many ways resembled the fractured frontier world in which their state had first emerged. For decades, the Ottoman frontier had expanded slowly across northwestern Anatolia, pressing against the last Byzantine strongholds that still remained in the region. Towns such as Bursa, Nicaea, and Nicomedia gradually fell under Ottoman control during the early 14th century, and each conquest strengthened the young state both economically and strategically. Yet even as the Ottomans consolidated their authority in Anatolia, another opportunity was beginning to appear just across a narrow stretch of water. Beyond the Dardanelles lay the Balkan Peninsula, a region that belonged largely to Christian kingdoms and to the weakened Byzantine Empire. In later centuries, this crossing would be remembered as the moment when the Ottomans entered Europe, but at the time it did not appear as the beginning of a vast imperial campaign. Instead, it emerged from a combination of regional instability, political alliances, and the continuing logic of frontier warfare that had already shaped Ottoman expansion in Anatolia. The Byzantine Empire in the 14th century was no longer the powerful state it had once been. Internal civil wars repeatedly divided the imperial court, while rival factions sought allies wherever they could find them. In several of these conflicts, Byzantine leaders turned to Turkish rulers in Anatolia for military assistance, inviting them to send troops across the straits in exchange for payment or political support. Ottoman forces were among those who participated in these interventions, and through them they became increasingly familiar with the geography and politics of the Balkans. The crossing into Europe, therefore, did not initially occur as a single dramatic invasion, but as a gradual process shaped by Byzantine internal struggles. One event, however, would prove especially important. In 1354, a powerful earthquake struck the region around the strategic fortress of Gallipoli, located on the European side of the Dardanelles. Contemporary sources describe how the earthquake damaged walls and buildings throughout the area, forcing many inhabitants to abandon the town temporarily. Ottoman forces quickly moved to occupy the site, recognizing its strategic value as a bridgehead between Asia and Europe. From Gallipoli, they could transport soldiers across the narrow straits and establish a permanent presence in the Balkans. Byzantine authorities attempted to negotiate the return of the fortress, but the Ottomans refused to withdraw. What had begun as a temporary occupation soon became a lasting foothold. The importance of Gallipoli was not simply geographical, though its location made movement between Anatolia and Europe far easier. It also symbolized a shift in the scale of Ottoman ambitions. For the first time, Ottoman rulers possessed territory on the European side of the straits that they intended to keep. This foothold allowed frontier warriors to conduct raids deeper into the Balkans, while also providing a base for future campaigns. The political situation in southeastern Europe made such expansion possible. Much like Anatolia in the previous century, the Balkans were divided among multiple states whose rivalries often prevented effective cooperation. Serbia, Bulgaria, and the Byzantine remnants competed for influence, while local nobles sometimes pursued their own interests, independent of larger kingdoms. These divisions meant that the Ottomans did not encounter a unified European resistance when they first appeared in the region. Instead, they faced a fragmented landscape in which alliances shifted frequently and opportunities for expansion appeared wherever local conflicts weakened defenses. The Ottoman crossing into Europe therefore followed a pattern familiar from their earlier frontier experience: gradual movement into contested territory, exploitation of political divisions, and the establishment of fortified positions that could support further advance. What began as a limited foothold at Gallipoli would soon develop into a broader campaign that carried Ottoman armies deep into the Balkan interior, marking the beginning of a new stage in the long relationship between the Ottoman state and the European world. Once the Ottomans secured their foothold at Gallipoli, the character of their frontier expansion began to change. The narrow straits that had once marked the edge of their world no longer served as a barrier. Instead, they became a corridor through which soldiers, supplies, and settlers could move regularly between Anatolia and southeastern Europe. Ottoman forces did not immediately attempt to conquer the entire Balkan Peninsula. in a single sweeping campaign. The expansion that followed Gallipoli remained gradual, shaped by the same frontier methods that had defined the earlier Ottoman advance in Anatolia. Raids probed the countryside, alliances were formed with local factions, and small strongholds were captured or negotiated into submission. Each gain strengthened the Ottoman position and opened routes for further movement into the interior of the Balkans. The political landscape of the region made this method particularly effective. 14th century southeastern Europe was divided among several kingdoms and principalities whose rivalries often prevented coordinated resistance. The Byzantine Empire still controlled important cities but lacked the strength to defend large rural territories. The Serbian kingdom had experienced a brief period of expansion under Stefan Dušan earlier in the century. Yet after his death in 1355, the Serbian state fragmented into competing regional authorities. Bulgaria was similarly divided between rival rulers whose resources were limited and whose priorities did not always align. These divisions created a political environment in which no single power could organize a sustained defense across the entire region. For Ottoman commanders operating from Gallipoli, the Balkans therefore resembled the frontier conditions they had known in Anatolia decades earlier, a landscape of divided authorities, fortified towns separated by wide rural spaces, and local leaders who sometimes preferred negotiation over prolonged war. Ottoman raids gradually extended into Thrace and nearby territories, weakening local defenses and establishing patterns of tribute or cooperation with some communities. In several cases, local rulers sought Ottoman assistance in their own conflicts, repeating a pattern already familiar from Byzantine civil wars. These arrangements allowed Ottoman forces to travel deeper into Balkan politics while gaining knowledge of routes, fortresses, and alliances. Military mobility also played an important role in this early stage of expansion. Ottoman cavalry units were particularly effective at rapid movement across the countryside, striking villages or supply centers, and then withdrawing before larger armies could assemble. Such raids did not always aim to capture territory immediately. Instead, they created pressure on surrounding regions, encouraging local authorities to accept Ottoman influence or tribute in order to avoid repeated devastation. Over time, these arrangements weakened resistance and prepared the ground for more permanent control. The capture of key towns in Thrace during the later 14th century further strengthened the Ottoman presence in Europe. One of the most significant developments occurred when the Ottomans took the city of Adrianople, known today as Edirne, around the early 1360s. The city stood at a strategic crossroads, linking the Balkans with the routes leading toward Constantinople and the Danube basin. Establishing control there allowed Ottoman rulers to coordinate operations across a wider European territory while maintaining communication with Anatolia. Edirne soon became an important administrative and military center, symbolizing the growing permanence of Ottoman power in the region. By the time these developments unfolded, the Ottoman state was no longer merely conducting frontier raids from Asia. It had established a functioning base of operations within Europe itself. This shift marked the beginning of a long period during which the Ottoman Empire would become deeply involved in the political life of the Balkans and the wider European world, transforming what had once been a narrow border conflict into a sustained struggle between expanding imperial power and the divided states of southeastern Europe. As Ottoman forces moved deeper into the Balkans during the later 14th century, the expansion that had once appeared as scattered frontier raiding began to look increasingly like the rise of a new regional power. Local rulers across southeastern Europe gradually realized that the Ottomans were not simply temporary allies or opportunistic raiders who would eventually withdraw across the straits. Instead, they were establishing a durable political presence supported by fortified cities, organized military forces, and a leadership capable of coordinating campaigns across both Anatolia and Europe. The growing Ottoman position in cities such as Edirne allowed their rulers to dispatch armies northward and westward with greater consistency, bringing them into more direct confrontation with the Balkan states that still controlled large parts of the peninsula. Among the earliest major confrontations were battles involving coalitions of regional powers attempting to slow the Ottoman advance. One such encounter occurred along the Maritsa River in 1371, when forces associated with Serbian regional leaders advanced into Thrace in an effort to challenge the expanding Ottoman presence. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe how Ottoman troops launched a sudden attack on the camp of the opposing army during the night. The result was a severe defeat for the coalition, and the battle significantly weakened the remaining power of Serbian authorities in the southern Balkans. In the years that followed, several local rulers chose to recognize Ottoman overlordship rather than risk similar defeats. This arrangement often meant paying tribute and providing military assistance when requested, while still retaining a degree of internal authority over their territories. Such political relationships allowed the Ottomans to extend their influence without needing to occupy every district directly, creating a network of dependent states that supported further expansion. The pattern of conflict and accommodation repeated itself across the region. Some rulers resisted fiercely, organizing defensive alliances and attempting to mobilize larger armies against the advancing Ottomans. Others calculated that cooperation offered a better chance of preserving their positions. These choices reflected the complex realities of Balkan politics during the period. Many kingdoms were already dealing with internal divisions, succession disputes, and local rivalries. The arrival of a powerful new neighbor forced leaders to make difficult decisions about whether to confront or negotiate with the Ottoman state. One of the most significant confrontations came in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo. Forces associated with Serbian nobles and their allies confronted an Ottoman army in a major engagement that later gained deep symbolic importance in regional memory. Contemporary accounts of the battle are limited and sometimes contradictory, but historians generally agree that the encounter resulted in heavy losses on both sides. The Serbian leadership was severely weakened, while the Ottomans managed to maintain their strategic momentum in the Balkans. The battle also marked a turning point in the perception of Ottoman power. What had once been viewed as a frontier challenge was now recognized as a sustained military presence capable of defeating major coalitions. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottomans controlled large parts of Thrace and had established influence over several Balkan territories through direct rule or vassal arrangements. Their armies were operating deep inside southeastern Europe, and their rulers increasingly viewed the region not as a distant frontier, but as a central component of their growing state. The crossing at Gallipoli had therefore led to a transformation far greater than many observers at the time could have predicted. A small frontier principality that had once raided along the edges of Byzantine territory had now become a power shaping the political future of the Balkan Peninsula. From this point forward, the relationship between the Ottoman state and the European world would no longer be defined by occasional border conflict, but by a long and evolving struggle for influence, territory, and survival. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottoman state had become firmly established in the Balkans, yet conquest alone could not guarantee long-term control over such a diverse and heavily populated region. The territories now falling under Ottoman authority contained large Christian populations, long-standing local elites, and economic systems that had developed under Byzantine and Balkan rule for centuries. If the Ottomans had relied only on raiding and military occupation, their power in southeastern Europe would likely have remained unstable. Instead, the Ottoman leadership gradually developed methods of governance that allowed them to transform newly conquered lands into functioning provinces of a growing empire. This process of building administrative order was essential to the long conflict between the Ottoman state and European powers, because it created the stability and resources that allowed Ottoman armies to campaign repeatedly across the continent. One of the most important features of early Ottoman rule in the Balkans was the decision not to destroy existing agricultural and urban life. When Ottoman armies captured towns or rural districts, they usually preserved the economic structures that allowed those communities to survive. Farmers continued cultivating their fields, merchants continued trading in regional markets, and many local officials retained roles within the new administration. Instead of forcing rapid cultural or religious change, Ottoman authorities focused first on maintaining revenue and stability. Land and taxation systems were reorganized so that income from agricultural production could support the military class that formed the backbone of Ottoman expansion. Through these policies, the Ottomans ensured that conquered territories would contribute to the strength of the state rather than becoming permanent zones of unrest. A key institution that helped organize this system was known as the Timar arrangement. Under this system, the Ottoman ruler granted the right to collect revenue from specific lands to cavalry soldiers who served the state. These soldiers, often called sipahis, were responsible for maintaining order in their assigned territories and for joining military campaigns when summoned. The land itself usually remained in the hands of local farmers, while the sipahi collected taxes that supported both his own livelihood and his military obligations. Because the income of these soldiers depended on the productivity of the land, they had an incentive to keep agricultural communities functioning rather than destroying them. This structure tied the economic life of the countryside directly to the military strength of the Ottoman state. The Timar system also helped integrate the Balkans into the expanding Ottoman political order. Lands captured from former Byzantine or Balkan rulers were recorded, measured, and incorporated into registers that defined the obligations of both the local population and the military administrators responsible for the area. While this process was gradual and sometimes uneven, it represented a clear shift away from the loose frontier coalition that had characterized the earliest Ottoman expansion. The state was becoming more organized, capable of coordinating taxation, land distribution, and military service across a wide territory. This administrative stability gave Ottoman rulers a significant advantage over many rival powers whose authority depended more heavily on temporary alliances among nobles. Another important aspect of Ottoman governance in the Balkans was a pragmatic approach toward religion. The majority of the population in newly conquered European territories remained Christian, and attempts to force rapid conversion would likely have created constant rebellion. Instead, Ottoman authorities generally allowed Christian communities to continue practicing their faith, maintaining churches and local religious leadership while paying taxes to the state. This policy reduced resistance and encouraged many communities to accept Ottoman rule as a manageable political reality rather than an existential threat. By combining military organization, economic continuity, and relative religious tolerance, the Ottoman state created a durable system of control across the Balkans. This system did not eliminate conflict, but it provided the stability required for the empire to maintain its presence in Europe for generations, transforming what had once been a frontier expansion into the foundation of a long imperial struggle with the rest of the continent. As Ottoman rule expanded across the Balkans, maintaining control over newly conquered territories required more than land administration and local arrangements with existing populations. The empire also needed a reliable military force that would remain loyal to the central authority of the Sultan rather than to regional nobles or tribal leaders. In many medieval states across Europe and the Middle East, rulers depended heavily on aristocratic warriors whose loyalty could shift with changing political circumstances. Ottoman rulers gradually developed a different approach, one that would become one of the most distinctive institutions of the empire. This system, known later as the devshirme, involved recruiting young boys from Christian communities in the Balkans and incorporating them into the service of the Ottoman state. The practice began to take shape during the 14th and 15th centuries as the empire sought ways to build a professional military and administrative class closely tied to the ruling dynasty. At regular intervals, officials collected groups of boys from rural Christian families, usually selecting those considered physically and intellectually capable. These children were taken into Ottoman service, converted to Islam, and trained within institutions designed to prepare them for roles within the imperial system. While the practice has often been described as a form of forced levy, its long-term effects were more complex than simple exploitation. The young recruits were removed from their original social environments and raised within structures that emphasized discipline, education, and loyalty to the Sultan. Some entered administrative schools, where they learned languages, statecraft, and military organization, eventually becoming high-ranking officials within the imperial government. Others were directed into the elite infantry corps known as the Janissaries, a military force that would become central to Ottoman power in Europe. The Janissaries differed from many contemporary armies in several important ways. Unlike feudal knights or temporary militias, they were salaried soldiers who served the state full-time. Their training emphasized discipline, coordination, and the use of organized infantry tactics. Because their status depended entirely on the Ottoman state, rather than on inherited land or noble lineage, their loyalty was closely tied to the authority of the Sultan. Over time, the Janissaries developed a reputation as one of the most effective military formations of the early modern world, particularly during the 15th and 16th centuries, when their organization and training gave them advantages over many rival forces. The Devshirme system therefore contributed to the creation of a new kind of imperial elite. Individuals who had begun life in Christian villages of the Balkans could rise to influential positions within the Ottoman government or military hierarchy. Several grand viziers and leading administrators of the empire emerged from this system, demonstrating how the Ottoman state incorporated diverse populations into its central institutions. From the perspective of imperial strategy, the system helped reduce the risk that powerful hereditary nobles might challenge the authority of the Sultan, a problem that troubled many European monarchies during the same era. By building a class of officials and soldiers whose careers depended entirely on the imperial administration, Ottoman rulers strengthened the cohesion of their expanding state. This institutional structure played a major role in sustaining Ottoman expansion into Europe. The combination of land-based cavalry forces, supported by the Timar system, and the disciplined infantry of the Janissaries, created a military balance capable of operating across different terrains and campaign conditions. As Ottoman armies continued advancing through the Balkans and toward the frontiers of Central Europe, these institutions ensured that the empire possessed both the administrative stability and the military organization necessary to sustain a long confrontation with European powers. By the 15th century, the Ottoman state had developed something that many frontier powers never managed to achieve: a durable system capable of governing large and diverse territories while continuing to expand militarily. The lands of the Balkans were no longer treated merely as distant frontier zones where raids took place. Instead, they had become integrated provinces that supported the wider structure of the empire. Agricultural production from rural districts helped sustain cavalry forces organized through the Timar system, while towns and trade routes provided tax revenue that strengthened the central treasury. At the same time, the administrative and military elite created through institutions such as the Devshirme and the Janissary Corps formed a professional class directly connected to the authority of the Sultan. Together, these arrangements allowed the Ottoman state to combine local stability with imperial ambition, transforming earlier patterns of frontier warfare into a coordinated system of governance and expansion. One result of this transformation was the emergence of the Balkans as a strategic base for further Ottoman campaigns. From cities such as Edirne, Ottoman rulers could coordinate movements across southeastern Europe while still maintaining access to Anatolia through the straits. This geographic position allowed armies to move north toward the Danube frontier, west toward the mountainous regions of the Balkans, or east toward the remaining territories of the Byzantine Empire. The state that had once been confined to a narrow frontier in Anatolia now operated across a wide transcontinental space linking Asia and Europe. Such a position offered enormous advantages in the long struggle that was gradually forming between the Ottoman Empire and the powers of Europe. Control over Balkan territories also meant control over key routes connecting the Mediterranean world with Central and Eastern Europe. Merchants, diplomats, and armies all moved through these corridors, and Ottoman authorities increasingly monitored and taxed this movement. As the empire consolidated its hold on the region, neighboring states began to recognize that the Ottomans were not simply another Balkan power competing for territory. They were becoming an imperial force capable of influencing events far beyond the peninsula itself. Hungarian rulers to the north, Venetian traders along the Adriatic coast, and the remnants of the Byzantine government in Constantinople all had to adjust their policies in response to this expanding state. Yet even as the Ottoman administration strengthened its control over the Balkans, one major obstacle to complete dominance in the region still remained. The ancient city of Constantinople continued to stand between the Ottoman territories of Europe and those of Anatolia. Although the Byzantine Empire had declined dramatically, the city itself retained immense symbolic and strategic importance. It sat at the meeting point of the Bosporus and the Sea of Marmara, controlling the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. For centuries it had served as the capital of a powerful empire and as a major center of trade, religion, and culture. For the Ottoman state, the continued existence of Constantinople represented both a challenge and an opportunity. As long as the city remained outside Ottoman control, the empire's territories on either side of the straits were not fully unified. Communication and military coordination between Anatolia and the Balkans required navigating around a city that was technically still ruled by the Byzantine emperor. At the same time, the weakening of Byzantine power suggested that the city might eventually fall to a determined campaign. Ottoman rulers during the early 15th century increasingly viewed the capture of Constantinople as a goal that could secure their empire's position between Asia and Europe. The institutions they had built in the Balkans, stable land administration, disciplined infantry, and loyal officials, provided the resources necessary to attempt such an undertaking. The frontier principality, founded generations earlier by Osman, had now become a structured imperial state, capable of planning campaigns on a scale far beyond the raids of its early history. Within a few decades, this evolving system would direct its attention toward the ancient walls of Constantinople, an event that would send shockwaves across the European world and mark a turning point in the long relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the continent. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had already become a powerful state, spanning large parts of both Anatolia and the Balkans. Yet one city still stood at the center of the political map, separating its territories. Constantinople, once the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and for centuries one of the most important cities in the world, remained outside Ottoman control. Although the Byzantine state had declined dramatically over the previous 2 centuries, the city itself continued to possess immense symbolic and strategic significance. Its massive land walls, constructed during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, had protected the city from numerous sieges across medieval history. These fortifications stretched across the western side of Constantinople in multiple defensive layers, combining thick stone walls, towers, and defensive ditches that made the city one of the most difficult strongholds to capture in Europe or the eastern Mediterranean. For earlier Ottoman rulers, the city had often been a target of pressure and blockade, but not yet the objective of a fully organized campaign. That situation began to change during the reign of Sultan Mehmed II, who ascended the Ottoman throne in 1451. Mehmed was still very young when he became sultan, yet contemporary sources and later historians agree that he possessed a clear understanding of the strategic importance of Constantinople. As long as the Byzantine capital remained independent, it represented both a symbolic rival and a practical obstacle to Ottoman authority across the straits. The city also maintained diplomatic connections with various European states, which meant that it could potentially serve as a base for alliances directed against Ottoman interests. Controlling Constantinople would therefore not only unify the empire's territories in Europe and Anatolia, but also remove a lingering center of political opposition within the region. By the time Mehmed came to power, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. The population of Constantinople had declined significantly compared to its peak in earlier centuries, and the imperial government struggled with limited financial and military resources. Despite this weakness, the city's fortifications still commanded respect, and any army attempting to capture it would face formidable defenses. Mehmed therefore approached the challenge with careful preparation. One of his earliest strategic decisions was to strengthen Ottoman control over the Bosporus, the narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. On the European side of the strait, an earlier fortress already existed, but Mehmed ordered the construction of a new and powerful stronghold on the opposite shore. This fortress, known today as Rumeli Hisara, allowed Ottoman forces to control naval movement through the Bosporus and restrict supplies that might reach Constantinople from the Black Sea. The construction of this fortress in 1452 signaled clearly that the Ottomans were preparing for a major confrontation. At the same time, Mehmed began assembling the resources required for a siege unlike any the Ottomans had previously attempted. Engineers and craftsmen were recruited to construct siege equipment, while large numbers of soldiers were gathered from across the empire. Among the most significant developments was the use of powerful artillery capable of damaging even the famous Theodosian walls. Large cannons, including several enormous bombards, were cast to fire heavy stone projectiles against the city's defenses. Although siege artillery had been used before in European warfare, the scale of the Ottoman preparations demonstrated that Mehmed intended to rely heavily on this technology during the coming campaign. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI faced the challenge of defending a vast city with limited manpower. Appeals for assistance were sent to various Christian powers across Europe, yet political divisions and competing priorities meant that large-scale help would not arrive in time. As preparations continued on both sides, the situation became increasingly clear. The Ottoman Empire had spent generations building the administrative strength, military organization, and territorial base necessary for sustained expansion in Europe. Now that system was being directed toward a single objective. The fate of Constantinople would soon become the focal point of a confrontation that would echo across the European world. In the spring of 1453, the long preparations of Sultan Mehmed II finally turned into action as the Ottoman army moved toward Constantinople and established positions around the city. For centuries, the capital of the Byzantine Empire had survived numerous sieges, and its defenders relied heavily on the strength of the Theodosian walls that protected the western land approach. These fortifications consisted of multiple defensive layers, including a deep outer ditch, a lower outer wall, and a massive inner wall reinforced by towers. Even weakened Byzantine rulers had managed to preserve these defenses, and for generations they had discouraged attackers who lacked the resources or technology to break them. When Mehmed's forces arrived outside the city, the defenders understood that the coming siege would test whether those famous walls could still protect Constantinople in a changing age of warfare. Inside the city, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine II organized a defense with the limited resources available to him. The population had declined significantly compared to earlier centuries, and the number of soldiers who could man the walls was relatively small. Contemporary estimates suggest that the defenders numbered only several thousand men, including Byzantine troops, volunteers from Genoa, and a handful of other European fighters who had come to assist the city. One of the most experienced commanders among them was Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese noble who brought professional soldiers skilled in defending fortified positions. These defenders were responsible for guarding miles of walls and towers that once had been protected by far larger armies. Despite the imbalance in numbers, the defensive advantages of Constantinople remained formidable. Ottoman forces surrounded the city on land, while their fleet attempted to control the surrounding waters, particularly the Golden Horn, a sheltered harbor that protected the northern side of the city. The Byzantines had stretched a heavy chain across the entrance to the harbor to prevent enemy ships from entering, a defensive measure that had been used successfully during earlier sieges. As a result, the Ottoman navy initially found it difficult to attack the harbor directly. Meanwhile, on the landward side, Mehmed's army began the systematic work of siege warfare. Ottoman artillery opened fire against the walls, including large bombards capable of launching massive stone projectiles. These weapons represented a significant technological development compared to earlier medieval sieges. While the walls of Constantinople were extremely strong, repeated bombardment gradually weakened sections of the defenses, and forced the defenders to carry out constant repairs. Each night, workers attempted to fill gaps and reinforce damaged areas, while soldiers remained alert for assaults that might follow the artillery fire. The siege, therefore, became a continuous struggle of endurance in which both sides attempted to outlast the other. One of the most remarkable episodes of the siege involved the Ottoman fleet and the problem of the Golden Horn. Unable to break the chain blocking the harbour entrance, Mehmed ordered an unexpected maneuver. Ottoman ships were transported over land on greased wooden tracks from the Bosporus into the waters of the Golden Horn behind the defensive chain. Contemporary sources describe how dozens of vessels were moved in this way, appearing suddenly inside the harbour and forcing the defenders to stretch their already limited resources even further. This maneuver allowed Ottoman forces to threaten parts of the city walls that had previously been less heavily defended. As the siege continued through April and May, the pressure on Constantinople intensified. Artillery fire, repeated assaults, and the growing presence of Ottoman forces around both land and sea defences gradually wore down the defenders. Supplies within the city were limited, and hopes for large reinforcements from Western Europe faded as weeks passed without major relief arriving. The Ottoman army, drawing on the resources of a vast empire and the administrative systems that had developed over previous generations, maintained the siege with increasing determination. By late May, the condition of the walls and the exhaustion of the defenders suggested that the final outcome might soon be decided, bringing the long history of the Byzantine capital closer to its dramatic conclusion. As May 1453 drew toward its final days, the siege of Constantinople had already lasted for several intense weeks. Continuous artillery fire had damaged sections of the city's land walls, and repeated Ottoman assaults had forced the defenders to spend their nights repairing breaches and reinforcing weakened towers. Inside the city, exhaustion was becoming a serious problem. The soldiers defending the walls had been fighting with limited numbers since the beginning of the siege, and every day brought new casualties. Emperor Constantine V remained within the city, personally encouraging the defenders and organizing the final preparations for what many now understood could be the last major assault. Reports from Ottoman camps suggested that Sultan Mehmed II was preparing for a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer persistence and numerical advantage. The final assault began in the early hours of 29 May. Ottoman forces launched waves of attacks against the weakened sections of the land walls, particularly near the area known as the Gate of Street, Romanus, where earlier bombardment had caused significant damage. The attacking troops included irregular fighters as well as more organized infantry units that followed them into the battle. This method of successive waves was intended to exhaust the defenders while gradually opening a path through the damaged fortifications. The defenders resisted fiercely, and for several hours the outcome remained uncertain. Soldiers under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani and other leaders fought to hold the breaches, while Byzantine troops and volunteers attempted to prevent Ottoman forces from gaining a permanent foothold inside the walls. During the fighting, Giustiniani was seriously wounded and removed from the battlefield. His departure weakened the coordination of the defense at a critical moment. As the assault continued, Ottoman troops eventually managed to penetrate sections of the outer defenses. Once attackers began entering through the breaches, the balance of the battle shifted rapidly. The defenders, already stretched across a vast perimeter, struggled to contain the advancing soldiers. Emperor Constantine II is believed to have joined the fighting near the walls during these final moments, and most historical accounts suggest that he was killed during the collapse of the defense, although the exact circumstances remain uncertain. By the morning of 29 May, Ottoman forces had secured control over the city. After centuries as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople had fallen. The conquest marked the end of a state that traced its origins back to the Eastern Roman Empire more than 1,000 years earlier. For the Ottoman Empire, the victory carried enormous significance. Mehmed II soon entered the city and began reorganizing it as the new capital of his expanding empire. Constantinople would later become known widely as Istanbul and would serve as the administrative and political center of Ottoman power for centuries. The city's strategic position allowed the Ottomans to control key trade routes and to coordinate military campaigns across both Europe and Asia with far greater efficiency than before. News of the fall of Constantinople spread quickly across Europe and the Mediterranean world. Many observers recognized that the balance of power in southeastern Europe had shifted dramatically. The Ottomans were no longer simply a rising regional force in the Balkans. They now possessed one of the most historically significant cities in the world and controlled the vital passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The conquest intensified fears among many European rulers that Ottoman armies might continue advancing deeper into the continent. At the same time, the event forced governments and religious leaders to reconsider how they would respond to a powerful empire that had firmly established itself as both a European and an Asian state. The fall of Constantinople, therefore, did not end the long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new phase in that conflict, one in which the Ottomans possessed a unified imperial capital and the resources to project their power far beyond the Balkans. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottoman Empire entered a new phase of expansion in which the center of gravity of its conflicts gradually shifted northward into southeastern and central Europe. The conquest of the Byzantine capital had unified the empire's territories on both sides of the straits and provided the Ottomans with a powerful administrative and logistical center. From Constantinople, now transformed into the imperial capital, Ottoman rulers could coordinate military campaigns across vast distances while maintaining strong connections between Anatolia and the Balkans. Yet, even as the empire consolidated its authority in these regions, the frontier between Ottoman territory and the remaining European powers did not stabilize into a quiet border. Instead, it evolved into a long and contested zone stretching across rivers, plains, and fortified cities, where warfare, diplomacy, and uneasy coexistence would continue for generations. One of the most important regions along this emerging frontier was the Danube Basin, particularly the territories connected to the Kingdom of Hungary. During the late 15th century, Hungary represented one of the strongest political and military powers in southeastern Europe, and its rulers understood that the expansion of the Ottoman Empire posed a serious challenge to their security. The Danube River itself formed a natural defensive line in many places, but controlling the frontier required far more than relying on geography. Both the Ottomans and their European rivals constructed networks of fortresses designed to protect key crossings, trade routes, and agricultural regions that supported their armies. These fortified towns became central features of the long confrontation between the Ottoman state and European powers. Warfare along this frontier rarely consisted of a single decisive campaign that permanently resolved the struggle. Instead, the conflict often unfolded through repeated raids, sieges, and counterattacks as both sides attempted to gain advantage over the other. Ottoman cavalry units could move quickly across open terrain, launching attacks on settlements and supply lines before withdrawing to fortified positions. European defenders responded with their own military forces and by strengthening castles and city walls along vulnerable routes. Over time, this pattern created a frontier environment in which local communities became accustomed to the presence of soldiers, scouts, and patrols moving through the countryside. Villages near the border often faced the constant possibility of raids, while fortified towns served as centers of defense and administration. The experience of frontier warfare therefore shaped everyday life for many people living in the Balkans and along the Danube Basin. For the Ottoman Empire, this frontier also provided opportunities to expand influence through a mixture of military pressure and political negotiation. Some regional leaders accepted Ottoman overlordship in exchange for protection or internal autonomy, while others resisted and aligned themselves with rival European powers. These shifting alliances meant that the frontier remained fluid rather than fixed, with control over certain territories changing hands multiple times during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The Ottoman administrative system, supported by revenue from agricultural lands and by the professional military forces developed in earlier generations, allowed the empire to sustain repeated campaigns across this broad region. At the same time, European rulers increasingly recognized that the Ottoman presence in southeastern Europe was not temporary. The fall of Constantinople had demonstrated the empire's capacity to conquer major cities, and continued Ottoman advances toward the Danube suggested that the balance of power in the region was undergoing a profound transformation. Hungarian leaders in particular invested heavily in defensive efforts designed to halt further Ottoman expansion. Fortifications were strengthened, armies were raised, and alliances were sought among neighboring states that feared the same threat. Yet despite these efforts, the frontier remained unstable. The long war between the Ottoman Empire and European powers did not unfold as a single dramatic struggle, but as a prolonged contest fought across countless fortresses, river crossings, and rural landscapes. This evolving frontier would soon produce some of the most significant battles of the era, as both sides attempted to determine whether the Ottoman advance could be contained or whether the empire would push even deeper into the heart of Europe. As the Ottoman frontier pressed steadily toward the Danube during the later 15th century, the Kingdom of Hungary became the central line of resistance against further Ottoman expansion into Europe. Unlike many Balkan states that had already fallen under Ottoman influence or direct control, Hungary possessed a relatively strong monarchy, significant military resources, and a strategic position controlling access to Central Europe. Hungarian rulers understood that the survival of their kingdom depended on maintaining a defensive barrier along the southern frontier, where Ottoman forces were increasingly active. This awareness transformed Hungary into one of the most important opponents the Ottoman Empire would face during the centuries-long conflict between the empire and the European world. The frontier between Ottoman territory and Hungary became a landscape defined by fortresses, patrols, and repeated military encounters. Castles and fortified towns guarded the main river crossings and roads leading northward from the Balkans. These defensive structures were not isolated monuments but parts of a broader system designed to slow Ottoman armies and provide safe positions from which local defenders could organize resistance. Hungarian military leaders also relied heavily on mobile forces capable of responding quickly to Ottoman raids. The warfare that developed along this frontier, therefore, combined traditional siege operations with fast-moving cavalry engagements across open countryside. One of the most influential figures in Hungary's struggle against the Ottomans during the mid-15th century was John Hunyadi, a military commander who rose to prominence through his campaigns along the southern frontier. Hunyadi understood that defending Hungary required more than waiting behind fortress walls. Instead, he organized offensive operations intended to disrupt Ottoman supply lines and prevent the empire from consolidating its position north of the Balkans. His campaigns during the 1440s included several major confrontations with Ottoman forces, some of which temporarily slowed Ottoman expansion and inspired hopes among European observers that the empire might be pushed back. Although these victories did not permanently reverse Ottoman gains, they demonstrated that Ottoman armies could be challenged under the right circumstances. One of the most dramatic moments of this struggle occurred in 1456 at the Siege of Belgrade. The fortress city of Belgrade occupied a crucial position where the Danube and Sava rivers met, controlling access to the interior of Hungary. Recognizing its strategic importance, Sultan Mehmed II led an Ottoman army to capture the city only 3 years after the fall of Constantinople. The siege that followed became one of the largest confrontations between Ottoman and European forces during the 15th century. Hungarian defenders under Hunyadi, supported by volunteers and local fighters, resisted repeated Ottoman assaults while attempting to break the siege. After intense fighting, the defenders managed to repel the Ottoman attack, forcing Mehmed's army to withdraw. The defense of Belgrade became widely celebrated across Europe as evidence that Ottoman expansion might still be contained. Yet even this victory did not end the long struggle along the frontier. Ottoman forces soon resumed campaigns across the Balkans and continued applying pressure to the Hungarian borderlands. The conflict therefore settled into a pattern that would define the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and many European states for generations. Neither side could easily eliminate the other's presence in the region. The Ottomans possessed vast resources and a disciplined military system capable of sustaining repeated campaigns, while Hungary and its allies maintained fortified defenses that made rapid conquest difficult. This balance created a prolonged frontier war, characterized by alternating periods of intense fighting and uneasy stability. Communities living near the border adapted to this reality, knowing that peace was often temporary and that the next campaign might arrive with little warning. As the decades passed after the fall of Constantinople, it became increasingly clear that the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the kingdoms of Europe would not be decided by a single dramatic victory. Instead, the struggle settled into a pattern that historians often describe as frontier warfare, a form of conflict that unfolded slowly across a vast landscape of fortresses, river crossings, forests, and agricultural plains. The frontier, stretching from the Adriatic Sea through the Balkans and toward the Danube, did not function as a clean political boundary. It was a broad zone where power shifted gradually and where both sides maintained networks of fortified towns designed to support military operations. Armies moved through this region not only during major campaigns, but also through constant smaller actions that shaped the balance of power year after year. These conditions meant that the war between the Ottoman Empire and its European rivals rarely produced a single decisive moment capable of ending the conflict entirely. Several factors contributed to this prolonged and inconclusive style of warfare. One was geography. The frontier between Ottoman territory and Central Europe covered hundreds of kilometers and included rivers, mountain ranges, marshlands, and fortified cities. Large armies could win battles in one area, while another section of the frontier remained unchanged. Even when one side captured a fortress or gained territory, holding that ground required constant reinforcement and supply. A successful campaign might shift the border slightly, but rarely enough to destroy the opponent's ability to continue fighting elsewhere. This geographic complexity made total victory extremely difficult for either side. Another factor was the nature of the political systems involved. The Ottoman Empire possessed a centralized administrative structure capable of mobilizing soldiers and resources from across a wide imperial territory. Through systems such as the Timar land grants and the Janissary Corps, the Ottoman state could organize armies that marched regularly into the frontier zones. At the same time, European resistance was rarely coordinated under a single authority. Instead, several kingdoms, principalities, and city-states maintained their own interests and strategies. Hungary, Venice, the Habsburg lands, and other powers all confronted the Ottoman Empire at different moments, sometimes cooperating but often acting independently. This fragmentation meant that the Ottomans rarely faced the combined strength of all European powers at once, while European states could continue resisting even after suffering setbacks in particular regions. Life along the frontier, therefore, became defined by a cycle of preparation and recovery rather than permanent resolution. Fortresses were repaired, garrisons were reinforced, and local populations adapted to living in areas where armies might appear with little warning. Raiding played an important role in this environment. Ottoman cavalry units often moved quickly through border regions, striking villages, seizing supplies, and returning before larger defensive forces could respond. European defenders conducted similar operations when opportunities appeared, creating a continuous exchange of pressure along the borderlands. Although these raids rarely changed the map dramatically, they weakened opponents over time and reminded frontier communities that the conflict was always present. This long frontier war also shaped the political thinking of rulers on both sides. Ottoman sultans recognized that steady pressure on the European borderlands could gradually expand imperial influence without requiring immediate conquest of every region. European rulers, in turn, understood that survival depended on maintaining strong defensive networks and seeking alliances whenever possible. As a result, the conflict evolved into a prolonged contest of endurance rather than a rapid campaign for total domination. By the early 16th century, the frontier system had become an established reality across southeastern Europe. Ottoman armies continued probing northward, while European states strengthened their defenses and prepared for the next stage of confrontation. In this environment, a new generation of Ottoman leadership would emerge, bringing renewed ambition and military power to the frontier. Under the rule of Sultan Süleyman I, later known as Süleyman the Magnificent, the empire would attempt some of its most dramatic advances into the heart of Europe, transforming the long frontier war into one of the defining struggles of the early modern world. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had already established itself as a dominant force across southeastern Europe and Anatolia, yet the scale of its power was about to expand even further under the rule of a new sultan. In 1520, Suleiman I ascended the Ottoman throne, inheriting a state that had been strengthened by generations of military expansion, administrative organization, and control over key trade routes linking Asia and Europe. Later, historians would remember him as Suleiman the Magnificent in Europe and as Suleiman the Lawgiver within the Ottoman world, titles reflecting both his military achievements and his efforts to refine the legal and administrative structures of the empire. His reign marked the moment when Ottoman power reached a level that deeply alarmed many rulers across Europe because the empire now possessed the resources and leadership capable of projecting military force far beyond the Balkan frontier that had defined earlier conflicts. When Suleiman became sultan, the frontier with Christian Europe still ran largely along the Danube basin and the defensive systems maintained by the Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary had long served as the central barrier, preventing Ottoman armies from advancing into the heart of Central Europe. Although the kingdom had resisted several Ottoman campaigns during the 15th century, its political stability had weakened over time due to internal disputes among nobles and the financial strain of maintaining a vast defensive frontier. This situation created conditions that Ottoman leaders carefully observed. A strong Hungary could slow Ottoman expansion, but a divided Hungary might provide an opportunity for a decisive campaign capable of reshaping the balance of power across the entire region. Suleiman began his reign with several campaigns designed to strengthen Ottoman control along this frontier. One of his earliest objectives was the fortress of Belgrade, the same strategic city whose defenders had repelled the Ottomans decades earlier during the siege of 1456. Located at the meeting point of the Danube and Sava rivers, Belgrade controlled the main routes leading northward into Hungary. Capturing the fortress would remove one of the most significant obstacles to further Ottoman advances. In 1521, Suleiman led a large army against the city, surrounding it by land, while Ottoman naval forces operated along the rivers to isolate the defenders. After weeks of pressure and bombardment, Belgrade finally fell to Ottoman forces. This victory was strategically important because it opened the gateway into the Hungarian interior and demonstrated that the defensive barrier that had once protected Central Europe was weakening. With Belgrade under Ottoman control, the balance along the frontier began to shift. The fall of the fortress forced European observers to reconsider the strength of Ottoman arms and the vulnerability of the Hungarian kingdom. Suleiman's government continued preparing for further campaigns, drawing on the military institutions that had been developed over the previous centuries. Cavalry forces supported by the Timar system could move rapidly across frontier regions, while the disciplined Janissary infantry provided a reliable core for large-scale battles and sieges. Artillery, which had proven decisive during earlier campaigns, such as the capture of Constantinople, also played an increasingly important role in Ottoman warfare during this period. These combined forces created an army capable of operating effectively across the plains and fortresses of Central Europe. As the Ottoman military presence intensified along the Hungarian frontier, tensions grew between the expanding empire and the European states that feared further advances. Hungary attempted to reinforce its defenses and organize resistance, but the kingdom's internal divisions limited its ability to mobilize quickly and decisively. Meanwhile, Suleiman prepared for a campaign that would test the strength of Hungary's remaining defences and determine whether the Ottoman frontier would continue pushing deeper into Europe. Within only a few years, this confrontation would lead to one of the most consequential battles in the history of the region, a battle fought on the plains of southern Hungary that would dramatically alter the political landscape of Central Europe. 5 years after the capture of Belgrade, the confrontation between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary moved toward a decisive test on the plains of southern Hungary. By the mid-1520s, the political situation inside Hungary had grown increasingly fragile. King Louis II ruled a kingdom that faced serious internal divisions among powerful nobles, financial strain from maintaining frontier defenses, and growing anxiety about the expanding strength of the Ottoman Empire. Although warnings about the Ottoman threat had circulated across Europe for years, coordinated assistance from other Christian powers remained limited. Many rulers were occupied with their own rivalries, including conflicts within the Holy Roman Empire and wars between major European states. As a result, Hungary largely faced the coming confrontation with its own resources. Sultan Suleiman I, observing these weaknesses, organized a major campaign in 1526 intended to break the Hungarian defensive system and extend Ottoman influence deeper into Central Europe. The Ottoman army that advanced toward Hungary was one of the most formidable forces assembled by the empire during the early 16th century. It included disciplined Janissary infantry, large numbers of cavalry supported by the Timar system, artillery units capable of supporting battlefield operations, and logistical arrangements developed through decades of imperial administration. Ottoman forces moved northward through the Balkans, crossing the Danube and advancing toward the Hungarian interior. Hungarian leaders gathered their own army in response, consisting of royal troops, noble cavalry, and additional forces raised from across the kingdom. Yet the process of assembling these forces was slow, and the resulting army was smaller than the Ottoman force that approached from the south. The two armies met on 29 August 1526 near the town of Mohacs, a location characterized by open plains that allowed large armies to maneuver. The Hungarian leadership hoped to confront the Ottomans before they could advance further into the kingdom, but the terrain and the imbalance of forces made the situation extremely dangerous. As the battle began, Hungarian cavalry launched aggressive attacks intended to break the Ottoman formations quickly. At first, these charges created some pressure on the advancing Ottoman lines. However, the Ottoman army had prepared defensive positions supported by artillery and disciplined infantry. As Hungarian forces pushed forward, they encountered coordinated resistance from Janissary units and cannon fire that disrupted their formations. The battle unfolded rapidly, lasting only a few hours, yet producing devastating consequences for the Hungarian army. Ottoman troops gradually overwhelmed the Hungarian forces, whose lines began to collapse under sustained pressure. Many Hungarian nobles and commanders were killed during the fighting, and the royal army disintegrated as units attempted to retreat across difficult terrain. King Louis II himself died during the aftermath of the battle while fleeing the field, an event that left the Hungarian kingdom suddenly without clear leadership. The defeat at Mohacs represented one of the most dramatic military disasters in Hungarian history. Within a single day, the kingdom had lost much of its political leadership and a large portion of its military strength. For the Ottoman Empire, the victory opened the road toward the central plains of Hungary and demonstrated the extraordinary effectiveness of the imperial army under Suleiman's command. Yet the consequences of Mohacs were not limited to the battlefield alone. The collapse of Hungarian authority created a political vacuum that would draw several powers into a prolonged struggle over the future of the region. Ottoman forces soon entered the Hungarian capital of Buda, while rival European dynasties began competing for control of the remaining territories of the kingdom. Instead of ending the long conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, the battle at Mohacs transformed it into a wider contest involving multiple states and competing claims to power across Central Europe. The consequences of the Battle of Mohacs quickly reshaped the political landscape of Central Europe, but the victory did not give the Ottoman Empire immediate and uncontested control over Hungary. Instead, the collapse of the Hungarian monarchy created a complicated struggle for succession that drew multiple powers into the region. After the death of King Louis II, different factions within Hungary supported rival claimants to the throne. One group of nobles backed John Zápolya, a Hungarian leader who sought Ottoman support to secure his position, while another faction recognized Ferdinand of Habsburg, the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This division effectively split Hungary into competing political camps, turning the region into a contested frontier between the Ottoman Empire and the expanding influence of the Habsburg dynasty. For Sultan Suleiman, this political conflict presented both opportunity and challenge. Supporting John Zápolya allowed the Ottoman Empire to maintain influence within Hungary without immediately administering the entire territory directly. At the same time, the growing involvement of the Habsburg monarchy meant that the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Europe was entering a new phase. The struggle was no longer limited primarily to Balkan states and frontier fortresses. It now involved one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. The Habsburg rulers controlled extensive territories in Central Europe and possessed the resources to organize large defensive campaigns against further Ottoman expansion. Tensions between these powers soon led to one of the most dramatic confrontations of Suleiman's reign. In 1529, the Ottoman army marched northward once again, this time with the intention of confronting Habsburg power directly. The campaign ultimately brought Ottoman forces to the gates of Vienna, the capital of Habsburg Austria. Vienna held immense strategic significance. If the city were captured, Ottoman influence would extend deep into Central Europe and threaten the political heart of the Habsburg domains. The march toward Vienna therefore represented the furthest westward advance of Ottoman military power during Suleiman's early reign. Yet the conditions surrounding the campaign were difficult. The Ottoman army had traveled great distances across the Balkans and Hungary, and heavy rains had damaged roads and slowed the movement of artillery. Supply lines stretched across large territories that had already experienced years of warfare. By the time Ottoman forces arrived outside Vienna in the autumn of 1529, the season was already turning colder, and the logistical challenges of maintaining a prolonged siege were increasing. The defenders of Vienna, aware of the importance of the city, had strengthened their fortifications and prepared to resist. Soldiers from across Habsburg territories and local militias worked together to reinforce the walls and organize defensive positions. When Ottoman forces began their attempts to breach the defenses, they encountered determined resistance supported by the strong fortifications of the city. Mining operations and artillery bombardment were used to weaken sections of the walls, but repeated assaults failed to produce a decisive breakthrough. Weather conditions, supply difficulties, and the determined defense gradually reduced the prospects of a successful siege. After several weeks of fighting, Suleiman eventually ordered the withdrawal of the Ottoman army. The siege of Vienna, therefore, ended without the dramatic victory that some observers had feared. Nevertheless, the campaign carried enormous symbolic weight across Europe. The appearance of Ottoman armies at the gates of Vienna confirmed that the empire had become one of the most powerful military forces of the age. At the same time, the successful defense of the city demonstrated that Ottoman expansion could be resisted under certain circumstances. The frontier war between the Ottoman Empire and Europe would continue for many decades, but the events surrounding Mohacs and Vienna revealed both the extraordinary reach of Ottoman power and the limits that geography, logistics, and determined opposition could impose on imperial ambition. Despite the dramatic victories of the Ottoman Empire during the 16th century and the appearance of Ottoman armies at the gates of Vienna, Europe did not collapse under the pressure of this expanding imperial power. In fact, one of the most striking features of the long conflict between the Ottomans and the European world is that neither side succeeded in eliminating the other. The Ottoman Empire remained a dominant military force across southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, yet the kingdoms and states of Europe continued to survive and reorganize in ways that prevented a complete Ottoman breakthrough into the center of the continent. Understanding why this balance emerged requires looking not only at military strength, but also at the political structure of Europe itself during the early modern period. Unlike the Ottoman Empire, which operated under a relatively centralized imperial authority, Europe was divided among many competing states that often pursued their own interests even when facing a shared threat. At first glance, this fragmentation might appear to weaken European resistance, and in some ways it did. Rivalries between powerful rulers frequently prevented the formation of a unified coalition capable of confronting the Ottoman Empire with all the resources of the continent. Yet this same fragmentation also created a political system in which the defeat of one state did not necessarily lead to the collapse of the entire region. When one kingdom weakened, another could rise to fill the gap. The political map of Europe was therefore constantly shifting, producing a balance in which no single defeat automatically opened the entire continent to conquest. During the 16th century, several major powers shaped this system. The Habsburg dynasty controlled large territories, including Austria, parts of Hungary, and lands within the Holy Roman Empire. Spain, also ruled by the Habsburg family during much of this period, possessed vast resources from overseas territories in the Americas. France remained another major kingdom with its own ambitions in European politics. Meanwhile, smaller states, maritime republics such as Venice, and various principalities across Central Europe all played roles in the diplomatic and military struggles of the time. These powers did not always cooperate with one another. In many cases, they were deeply suspicious of each other's intentions and engaged in wars that had little to do with the Ottoman frontier. Yet this constant competition produced a system often described by historians as a balance of power. No single European state could easily dominate the others, and alliances shifted repeatedly as rulers attempted to prevent their rivals from becoming too strong. Within this environment, the Ottoman Empire became one factor among many shaping European politics rather than the sole determining force. Even more striking was the fact that some European powers occasionally cooperated with the Ottomans when it suited their strategic interests. The most famous example involved the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and France during the 16th century. French rulers viewed the Habsburg dynasty as their principal rival within Europe, particularly because Habsburg territories surrounded France on multiple sides. In this situation, an understanding with the Ottomans could serve French interests by applying pressure to the Habsburg frontier in Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Although such cooperation did not mean a formal alliance in the modern sense, it demonstrated how the political complexity of Europe shaped the wider conflict. Instead of confronting a united continent, the Ottoman Empire often encountered a shifting network of states whose relationships changed according to their own rivalries and ambitions. These conditions made the long war between the Ottomans and Europe far more complicated than a simple clash between two civilizations. The struggle unfolded within a dynamic political system in which diplomacy, alliances, and rivalries played as much of a role as armies and fortresses. As a result, the expansion of the Ottoman Empire reached impressive heights during the 16th century, yet the structure of European politics prevented the kind of unified collapse that some observers had once feared. While the Ottoman Empire confronted European states along a vast frontier stretching from Hungary to the Mediterranean, the political life of Europe itself remained dominated by rivalries that often had little connection to the Ottoman threat. Throughout the 16th century, many of the most powerful rulers in Europe devoted enormous resources to conflicts with their neighbors, rather than to a unified effort against Ottoman expansion. These struggles shaped the broader balance of power in ways that indirectly influenced the long war between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the continent. Instead of forming a permanent alliance against the Ottomans, European kingdoms frequently found themselves fighting one another over territory, dynastic claims, religious disputes, and commercial competition. This pattern of internal rivalry repeatedly limited the scale of coordinated resistance that might otherwise have developed along the Ottoman frontier. One of the most important examples of this dynamic was the long series of conflicts between the Habsburg dynasty and the Kingdom of France. During the 16th century, the Habsburg rulers controlled an enormous collection of territories including Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and lands within the Holy Roman Empire. From the perspective of French leaders, this expanding Habsburg power posed an immediate strategic danger because it surrounded France on several sides. As a result, the French monarchy focused much of its energy on limiting Habsburg influence rather than concentrating entirely on the Ottoman threat in southeastern Europe. These rivalries produced repeated wars across Italy and Central Europe, drawing attention and military resources away from the Ottoman frontier. At the same time, religious tensions within Europe further complicated the political landscape. The Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, divided large parts of the continent between Catholic and Protestant communities. These divisions soon led to political conflicts that shaped alliances and loyalties within the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Some rulers feared religious rivals within Europe as much as they feared the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. This meant that military resources were often directed toward maintaining internal stability or confronting neighboring states, rather than toward a coordinated continental defense. The resulting fragmentation ensured that European responses to Ottoman campaigns varied widely depending on local political circumstances. These rivalries occasionally produced situations in which European powers indirectly benefited from Ottoman pressure on their enemies. When Ottoman armies advanced toward Habsburg territories in Hungary or Austria, French leaders sometimes saw an opportunity to weaken their principal rival. Similarly, various smaller states along the Mediterranean and in the Balkans adjusted their policies depending on which alliance appeared most advantageous at a given moment. Diplomacy, therefore, played a complex role in the broader struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. Political calculations were rarely based on ideology alone. Rulers often made decisions according to strategic advantage rather than shared religious identity. From the Ottoman perspective, this fragmented political environment could be advantageous. Ottoman leaders did not need to defeat all European states simultaneously in order to maintain their position. Instead, they could concentrate their military strength along particular frontiers while observing the rivalries that divided their opponents. Campaigns against Habsburg territories in Hungary, naval operations in the Mediterranean, and diplomatic exchanges with various European courts all formed part of a wider strategy that took advantage of the continent's internal divisions. This approach allowed the Ottoman Empire to remain a central participant in European politics for decades, even while facing determined resistance in particular regions. The result was a prolonged balance in which neither side achieved total dominance. European states continued to resist Ottoman expansion along fortified frontiers, yet their internal rivalries prevented the formation of a stable and unified coalition capable of permanently pushing the empire out of southeastern Europe. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire maintained impressive military strength, but could not easily exploit Europe's divisions to conquer the entire continent. The conflict, therefore, continued as a long and shifting contest, shaped as much by diplomacy and rivalry as by battlefield victories. Over time, the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the states of Europe developed into something more complicated than a simple confrontation between two opposing worlds. The empire remained a powerful rival in military terms, yet it also became deeply connected to the diplomatic and economic systems that shaped European politics. By the 16th century, Ottoman rulers were not isolated outsiders standing beyond the political order of the continent. Instead, they were active participants in a network of negotiations, alliances, trade agreements, and strategic calculations that linked courts from Istanbul to Venice, Paris, and Vienna. This reality created a paradox that many observers at the time struggled to understand. The same empire that European rulers often described as a threat to Christian lands was also an empire with which they negotiated treaties, exchanged ambassadors, and conducted profitable commerce. Trade played a particularly important role in this evolving relationship. The Ottoman Empire controlled territories that connected major commercial routes between the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the eastern regions of Asia. Merchants from Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa had long been active in these trade networks even before the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. After the city became the Ottoman capital, commercial connections did not disappear. Instead, they adapted to the new political reality. European merchants continued operating in Ottoman ports, transporting goods such as grain, textiles, metals, and spices across the Mediterranean world. In return, the Ottoman state collected customs revenues that strengthened the imperial treasury. These economic relationships created incentives for cooperation even during periods of political tension. Diplomatic exchanges also became increasingly common. Ambassadors from European courts traveled to the Ottoman capital to negotiate agreements, observe political developments, and represent the interests of their rulers. Ottoman envoys likewise visited European courts, carrying messages and proposals that reflected the empire's growing role in continental politics. These diplomatic contacts demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire had become an established power whose influence could not simply be ignored. Even rulers who feared Ottoman expansion recognized the necessity of maintaining communication with a state that controlled vast territories and strategic trade routes. The presence of these diplomatic and commercial ties did not eliminate conflict. Military campaigns continued along the frontier in Hungary, naval battles occurred in the Mediterranean, and rival alliances shifted repeatedly as different powers pursued their own interests. Yet the existence of regular negotiations and economic connections meant that the Ottoman Empire was woven into the same political system that shaped relations among European states themselves. Wars could be followed by treaties, alliances could change, and trade often continued even when armies confronted one another on distant battlefields. This situation reflected a broader transformation in the nature of international politics during the early modern period. Instead of a world divided into completely separate civilizations, the regions surrounding the Mediterranean and southeastern Europe functioned as interconnected spaces where diplomacy, commerce, and warfare overlapped. The Ottoman Empire, by virtue of its geographic position and military strength, became one of the central actors within this system. European states learned to balance confrontation with negotiation, resisting Ottoman expansion in some areas while cooperating in others when strategic interests required it. As the 16th century progressed, this complex relationship continued shaping the long war between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. Neither side could easily eliminate the other, and both gradually adapted to a reality in which conflict and coexistence existed simultaneously. The Ottoman Empire remained a formidable military power, yet it was also deeply entangled with the economic and diplomatic networks of the continent it confronted. This paradox would continue influencing European history for generations, shaping the conditions under which the next phase of the Ottoman-European struggle would unfold. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the long conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the states of Europe began to enter a different phase, not because the empire had suddenly become weak, but because the conditions that had once favored rapid Ottoman expansion were slowly changing. For nearly 2 centuries, Ottoman armies had moved steadily across southeastern Europe, capturing cities, defeating regional kingdoms, and establishing a frontier that pushed deep into the continent. Yet as time passed, that frontier stopped behaving like an open field of conquest and instead hardened into a heavily defended borderland. Along the Danube and across the plains of Hungary, both sides constructed dense systems of fortresses designed to control roads, river crossings, and supply routes. These fortifications created a landscape where major advances became far more difficult than they had been during the earlier centuries of Ottoman expansion. Campaigns that once produced sweeping territorial gains now often resulted only in the capture or loss of a single fortress after months of siege warfare. Geography played an important role in this transformation. The frontier stretched across hundreds of kilometers and included rivers, wetlands, forests, and fortified towns that slowed the movement of large armies. Even when one side won a battlefield victory, the enemy could retreat behind defensive positions and reorganize for the next campaign. This meant that war along the frontier increasingly became a test of endurance rather than a race toward rapid conquest. At the same time, the European states facing the Ottoman Empire were beginning to adapt militarily to the realities of early modern warfare. During the 16th century, many European armies reorganized their forces around disciplined infantry formations, armed with firearms, supported by improved artillery and stronger centralized systems of taxation that allowed rulers to maintain larger standing armies. These developments gradually strengthened the defensive capabilities of states, such as the Habsburg monarchy, which controlled large territories in Central Europe and stood directly in the path of Ottoman expansion. While the Ottoman military system remained powerful and experienced, it now faced opponents who were better prepared to sustain long campaigns and defend fortified frontiers. The Ottoman Empire itself also had to manage the difficulties of governing a vast realm that stretched from the Middle East to North Africa and across southeastern Europe. Maintaining such an empire required enormous administrative coordination and financial resources. Campaigns along distant frontiers were expensive and time-consuming, and imperial leaders had to balance military ambitions with the demands of governing large populations and maintaining stability within the empire's core regions. None of these pressures meant that the Ottoman Empire had suddenly lost its strength. Ottoman armies still marched into Hungary and the Balkans, still besieged fortresses, and still posed a formidable threat to European powers. What had changed was the strategic environment in which those campaigns took place. The frontier had become a hardened line between two military systems that were both capable of defending themselves for long periods. This new balance meant that the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Europe would increasingly revolve around large but infrequent wars, in which each side attempted to break the stalemate and shift the frontier in its favor. By the late 17th century, that fragile balance would finally collapse during a confrontation that drew armies from across Europe and brought the Ottoman Empire once again to the gates of Vienna, setting the stage for one of the most decisive moments in the centuries-long struggle between the empire and the European world. More than 150 years after the first Ottoman army had appeared before the walls of Vienna, the city again became the focal point of a confrontation that would reshape the long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the powers of Europe. By the early 1680s, tensions along the frontier between the Ottoman territories in Hungary and the Habsburg lands of Central Europe had intensified once again. Political unrest within Hungary, where some nobles resisted Habsburg rule, created an opportunity that Ottoman leaders believed could be used to expand their influence. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha organized a massive campaign intended to break Habsburg power in the region and secure Ottoman dominance over the Hungarian plains. In 1683, a large Ottoman army marched northward through the Balkans and across Hungary, moving toward Vienna with the intention of capturing the city and forcing a decisive change in the balance of power in Central Europe. Vienna was not only the capital of Habsburg Austria, but also a crucial strategic gateway. If the city fell, Ottoman armies would gain access to the rich lands of southern Germany and the wider territories of the Holy Roman Empire. For the Habsburg rulers and their allies, the defense of Vienna therefore became a matter of survival rather than merely another frontier battle. As the Ottoman army approached, the defenders of the city began urgent preparations. Fortifications were strengthened, supplies were gathered, and soldiers from various regions of the Habsburg lands joined the garrison. When the Ottoman forces arrived in July 1683, they surrounded Vienna and began the familiar process of siege warfare, digging trenches and attempting to weaken the city's walls through artillery and mining operations beneath the fortifications. For weeks, the siege continued, while the defenders struggled to hold their positions. Meanwhile, across Europe, news of the siege spread quickly, prompting diplomatic and military responses from rulers who feared that the fall of Vienna could open the path for further Ottoman advances. One of the most significant developments was the formation of a relief army composed of forces from several European states, including troops from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under the command of King John III Sobieski. These forces marched toward Vienna in an effort to lift the siege before the city's defenses collapsed. In September 1683, the relief army reached the hills overlooking the city, where Ottoman forces had established positions around Vienna's walls. What followed was one of the largest battles fought in Europe during the 17th century. The combined European forces launched an attack designed to break the Ottoman siege lines and relieve the defenders inside the city. After intense fighting across the hills and fields outside Vienna, the relief army succeeded in driving Ottoman forces back from their positions. King Sobieski's cavalry charge near the end of the battle became one of the most famous episodes of the campaign, symbolizing the moment when the balance of the battle shifted decisively. The Ottoman army eventually retreated, ending the siege and marking a dramatic turning point in the long conflict between the Empire and Europe. The failed siege of Vienna did not immediately destroy Ottoman power in the region, but it changed the strategic direction of the war. For the first time in generations, European states began organizing coordinated campaigns that pushed Ottoman forces back from territories they had controlled for decades. The confrontation at Vienna therefore became more than a single military event. It marked the beginning of a period in which the initiative along the frontier would increasingly pass from the Ottoman Empire to the European powers that had once struggled simply to defend themselves. The defeat of the Ottoman army outside Vienna in 1683 did not immediately end the presence of the empire in Central Europe, but it triggered a chain of events that dramatically altered the balance of power along the long frontier between the Ottomans and the European states. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had often held the strategic initiative, launching campaigns into Hungary and threatening the borders of the Habsburg lands. After Vienna, however, European rulers recognized that a rare opportunity had emerged. Instead of simply defending their territories, they now attempted to push the Ottoman frontier southward. This shift led to the formation of a military alliance that became known as the Holy League, a coalition that included the Habsburg monarchy, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Republic of Venice, later joined by other European powers. Their shared goal was to drive Ottoman forces out of large parts of Central Europe and reclaim territories that had been contested for generations. What followed was a long and difficult conflict that historians often describe as the Great Turkish War, lasting from 1683 until the end of the 17th century. During these years, armies from the Holy League moved steadily into territories that had once been firmly within the Ottoman sphere of influence. Campaigns unfolded across Hungary, the Balkans, and along the Danube frontier, where so many earlier wars had been fought. Fortresses that had stood as Ottoman strongholds for decades were now besieged by European forces, determined to reverse the outcome of earlier centuries of conflict. The struggle was neither quick nor easy. Ottoman armies continued to resist fiercely, and many battles produced heavy casualties on both sides. Yet the overall direction of the war gradually shifted as the coalition armies gained ground across the Hungarian plains. One of the most important developments occurred in 1686, when Habsburg forces recaptured the city of Buda, the historic capital of Ottoman-controlled Hungary. The fall of Buda symbolized the beginning of a broader retreat of Ottoman authority in the region. For more than a century, the Ottomans had governed large sections of Hungary, using the territory as a base for campaigns deeper into Europe. Now the strategic situation was reversing. European armies were pushing southward, and Ottoman commanders were increasingly forced to defend territories that had once been launching points for imperial expansion. Over the following years, additional victories strengthened the position of the Holy League. Battles along the Danube and across the Balkan frontier gradually reduced Ottoman control over Central European territories. The empire remained powerful, but the momentum that had once carried its armies toward Vienna was fading. The war finally concluded in 1699 with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz, an agreement that marked one of the most significant territorial settlements in the history of the Ottoman-European conflict. Under the terms of the treaty, the Ottoman Empire ceded large parts of Hungary and other territories to the Habsburg monarchy and its allies. For the first time, the Ottomans were formally surrendering major European lands that had been held for generations. The treaty did not end the Ottoman Empire's role in European politics, but it clearly demonstrated that the long period of rapid Ottoman expansion into Central Europe had come to an end. From this point forward, the frontier between the empire and its European neighbors would continue to shift, yet the strategic direction of that movement had changed. Instead of advancing steadily northward, Ottoman authority in Europe would gradually begin to contract, opening a new chapter in the long relationship between the empire and the continent it had confronted for centuries. After the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the political map of southeastern Europe had changed in ways that would have been difficult to imagine during the earlier centuries of Ottoman expansion. For more than 200 years, the Ottoman Empire had steadily advanced into the Balkans and Central Europe, capturing fortresses, defeating regional kingdoms, and establishing a frontier that at times reached deep into Hungary. The agreement signed at Karlowitz marked a clear turning point in that long process. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire formally surrendered large territories in Europe to its rivals, especially to the Habsburg monarchy. This did not mean that the empire suddenly collapsed or lost its influence across the region. Ottoman rule still extended across much of the Balkans, including important provinces such as Bosnia, Serbia, and parts of Greece. Yet the strategic momentum that had once favored Ottoman expansion had shifted. The empire was now entering a period in which maintaining control over existing territories would prove as challenging as conquering new ones had once been. Several forces contributed to this gradual transformation. One was the rise of powerful neighboring states whose military and administrative systems were becoming increasingly effective. The Habsburg monarchy strengthened its position along the Danube frontier, reorganizing its defenses and integrating the newly acquired territories of Hungary into its imperial structure. At the same time, another major power began playing a growing role in the politics of southeastern Europe, the Russian Empire. During the 18th century, Russia expanded southward from the northern shores of the Black Sea, pursuing strategic goals that often brought it into conflict with Ottoman interests. Russian rulers sought access to warm water ports and influence over Orthodox Christian populations living under Ottoman rule. These ambitions meant that the Ottoman Empire now faced pressure not only from the Habsburg frontier in Central Europe, but also from the expanding Russian state in the east. The Ottoman government responded to these challenges with a mixture of military resistance and internal reform. Ottoman leaders recognized that the empire's traditional institutions had been extremely effective during earlier centuries of expansion. Yet the strategic environment was changing. European states were developing new administrative systems capable of mobilizing greater financial resources and sustaining large standing armies. Artillery technology, fortification design, and battlefield tactics were also evolving. Ottoman rulers, therefore, began exploring ways to modernize certain aspects of their military and administrative structures while preserving the authority of the imperial system that had governed their territories for generations. At the same time, the Balkans themselves were becoming more politically complex. Many communities living under Ottoman rule had experienced centuries of imperial administration, yet the influence of new political ideas and the pressures created by wars between empires gradually altered the political atmosphere of the region. Local leaders sometimes cooperated with Ottoman authorities, while in other cases resistance movements began emerging that reflected the changing dynamics of European politics during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Ottoman Empire thus faced a combination of external military pressure and internal transformation across the territories it had once conquered during the height of its expansion. Despite these challenges, the Ottoman state remained a major power in the international system for a long time after the Treaty of Karlowitz. Ottoman armies continued fighting wars with both Austria and Russia, sometimes losing territory but sometimes defending important regions successfully. The empire still controlled vital trade routes and governed millions of people across southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Yet the nature of the long Ottoman-European conflict had clearly evolved. The earlier centuries had been defined by the steady advance of Ottoman power into the Balkans and toward the heart of Europe. The new era that followed Karlowitz would increasingly revolve around the question of how long the Ottoman Empire could maintain its position within a rapidly changing political and military landscape. During the 18th century, the struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the European powers increasingly revolved around a series of wars with two expanding states that were reshaping the political map of Eastern and Central Europe: the Habsburg monarchy and the Russian Empire. While earlier centuries of conflict had focused primarily on the Balkans and the Hungarian frontier, the new geopolitical situation brought additional pressure from the north and east. Russia, in particular, emerged as a formidable rival. Under rulers such as Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, the Russian state expanded its military strength, modernized aspects of its administration, and pursued a strategic goal that placed it directly in opposition to Ottoman interests. Russian leaders sought access to the Black Sea and greater influence in the lands surrounding it, regions that had long been under Ottoman authority or within the empire's sphere of influence. This competition led to several major wars between the Ottoman and Russian empires throughout the 18th century. Russian armies advanced southward across the steppes north of the Black Sea, confronting Ottoman forces in a series of campaigns that gradually altered the balance of power in the region. These wars were not simple or one-sided struggles. Ottoman armies still possessed considerable strength and were capable of resisting Russian advances in many battles. Yet the strategic direction of the conflict increasingly favored the expansion of Russian influence. The Russian Empire's growing military capacity and its ability to project power toward the Black Sea allowed it to challenge Ottoman control over territories that had once been relatively secure. One of the most significant consequences of these conflicts involved the region of Crimea. For centuries, the Crimean Khanate had existed as an important Ottoman ally and vassal state. The Khanate's cavalry forces had often played a role in Ottoman military campaigns, and its territory formed a buffer between the Ottoman world and the expanding powers of Eastern Europe. During the 18th century, this political arrangement began to unravel under pressure from Russian expansion. Following a series of wars between the two empires, Russia gradually established dominance over the region. In 1783, the Russian Empire formally annexed Crimea, ending the long relationship between the Khanate and the Ottoman state. This development represented a major strategic loss for the Ottomans because it placed Russian power directly on the northern shores of the Black Sea and eliminated a key buffer that had once protected the empire's frontier. At the same time, the Habsburg monarchy continued pressing southward in Central Europe. Wars between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs during the 18th century produced shifting borders along the Danube frontier, with both sides capturing and losing fortresses in different campaigns. These struggles demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire was still capable of defending large territories, yet they also showed that the empire faced increasingly well-organized opponents whose military systems had continued evolving since the earlier centuries of Ottoman expansion. European armies now relied on large standing forces, improved artillery, and administrative systems capable of sustaining long wars. The Ottoman government attempted to respond to these pressures by introducing reforms intended to strengthen the military and administrative structure of the empire. Some sultans and officials recognized that adapting to the changing balance of power required adjustments in training, organization, and financial management. Reform efforts were often complicated by internal resistance and by the difficulty of transforming institutions that had existed for generations. Even so, these attempts revealed that Ottoman leaders understood the seriousness of the strategic situation confronting their empire. By the end of the 18th century, the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Europe had therefore entered a new stage. The empire remained a major power governing vast territories across southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, yet the direction of the long conflict had clearly changed. Instead of advancing steadily into the continent, as it had during the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman state was increasingly defending its remaining territories against rivals who were growing stronger with each generation. The long war that had once been defined by Ottoman expansion was now becoming a contest over how much of the empire's European lands could be preserved. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire continued to face pressures that gradually reshaped its position in Europe, and one of the most important developments during this period was the rise of nationalist movements across the Balkan Peninsula. For centuries, the Ottoman state had governed a wide variety of peoples with different languages, religions, and regional traditions. Earlier imperial administration had managed this diversity through local autonomy, religious communities, and provincial authorities that allowed many populations to maintain aspects of their cultural identity while remaining under Ottoman rule. Yet, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, new political ideas were spreading across Europe. Concepts of national identity, popular sovereignty, and political independence began influencing populations that had previously been integrated into large imperial systems. These ideas did not immediately overturn Ottoman authority, but they created a new political atmosphere in which local elites and communities increasingly imagined alternative futures outside imperial rule. One of the earliest and most influential examples of this change occurred in Greece. In 1821, a rebellion began that aimed to establish an independent Greek state after centuries of Ottoman administration. The uprising quickly expanded across parts of the Greek world, drawing attention from European powers whose political and cultural interests became involved in the conflict. For many Europeans, the Greek struggle carried symbolic significance because of the region's association with ancient classical history and Orthodox Christianity. As the conflict continued, diplomatic pressure and eventually military intervention from several European powers helped secure the independence of Greece in the 1830s. The creation of an independent Greek kingdom represented a major shift in the political structure of the Balkans and demonstrated that Ottoman authority in Europe could be challenged successfully under certain conditions. Similar movements gradually appeared in other regions of the Balkans during the 19th century. Serbia, which had experienced earlier uprisings against Ottoman rule, developed increasing autonomy and eventually emerged as an independent principality. Later in the century, additional nationalist movements gained strength in areas such as Romania and Bulgaria. These developments were shaped not only by local aspirations, but also by the broader geopolitical competition among European powers. Russia often presented itself as a protector of Orthodox Christian communities living within the Ottoman Empire, while the Habsburg monarchy and other states also sought influence across the Balkans. The region therefore became an arena where local nationalist movements intersected with the strategic interests of major European empires. The Ottoman government attempted to respond to these challenges through a series of reforms known collectively as the Tanzimat. Beginning in the mid-19th century, these reforms aimed to modernize aspects of Ottoman administration, law, and military organization while strengthening the central authority of the state. Reformers hoped that by improving governance and granting certain rights to imperial subjects, they could stabilize the empire and prevent further fragmentation. Some of these reforms introduced new legal codes, reorganized provincial administration, and attempted to create a more equal relationship between Muslim and non-Muslim populations within the empire. Although these changes represented serious efforts to adapt to the pressures of the modern world, they could not completely halt the powerful forces reshaping the Balkans. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had lost significant portions of its European territory. Independent or autonomous states had emerged across much of the peninsula, and the influence of European powers continued shaping the political future of the region. The empire still governed important areas such as parts of Macedonia and Albania, yet its position in Europe had clearly weakened compared with the earlier centuries when Ottoman armies had advanced toward the Danube and even the gates of Vienna. The long war between the Ottoman Empire and Europe had therefore evolved from a struggle over expansion into a slow process of contraction and political transformation. The empire that had once stood as one of the dominant military forces of the continent was now navigating the complex realities of a changing European order in which nationalism, diplomacy, and international competition played roles as significant as battlefield victories. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the centuries-long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the states of Europe had transformed so completely that it no longer resembled the conflicts that once carried Ottoman armies across the Balkans and toward the gates of Vienna. The empire that had begun as a small frontier principality on the edge of Byzantine territory, had grown into one of the largest and most influential political systems of the early modern world, governing lands that stretched from the Middle East to North Africa and deep into southeastern Europe. Yet the same historical forces that had once allowed the Ottomans to expand across continents were gradually reshaping the political landscape around them. Industrialization, the rise of modern nation-states, and the spread of nationalist movements were transforming the structure of international politics across Europe. In this new environment, the old imperial frontier between the Ottomans and Europe was dissolving, replaced by a complex network of independent states that had once been provinces of the empire. The Balkans, in particular, became the region where the final stages of this transformation unfolded. During the 19th century, several new nations had emerged from territories that had long been governed from Istanbul. Greece had established independence earlier in the century, followed by the growing autonomy and eventual independence of Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. These developments did not occur all at once, nor did they always follow peaceful paths. Wars, uprisings, and diplomatic negotiations repeatedly altered the borders of southeastern Europe. At the same time, the major European powers continued competing for influence in the region, often presenting themselves as protectors or supporters of newly forming states. The Ottoman Empire, therefore, found itself confronting a political environment very different from the one that had existed during the age of Suleiman the Magnificent. Instead of defending a frontier against a few rival kingdoms, the empire was now navigating a landscape filled with emerging nation-states and powerful external empires that sought influence over them. The final collapse of Ottoman authority in most of Europe came during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In these conflicts, several Balkan states formed alliances and launched coordinated military campaigns against the remaining Ottoman territories in the region. Within a short period, Ottoman control over much of the peninsula disappeared, leaving the empire with only a small portion of land in southeastern Europe centered around eastern Thrace and the city of Istanbul. For a state that had once governed vast stretches of the Balkans for centuries, this loss marked the end of an era. The frontier wars that had shaped European history for generations were effectively over, replaced by a new political map dominated by independent national states. Yet the long conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Europe had never been only a story of battles and shifting borders. Over centuries, it had also produced deep cultural, economic, and political connections that tied the regions together. Trade routes linking Mediterranean ports with Balkan markets had flourished under Ottoman rule. Diplomatic exchanges between Istanbul and European courts had shaped alliances and rivalries that influenced the balance of power across the continent. Even the architecture, cuisine, and urban life of many Balkan cities reflected centuries of interaction between Ottoman and European traditions. The history of conflict had therefore also been a history of contact, exchange, and mutual influence. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire itself was entering its final chapter. Internal reform movements, external pressures, and the global upheavals that accompanied the First World War would soon lead to the dissolution of the imperial system that had once stood at the center of the Ottoman-European struggle. Yet the legacy of those centuries remained embedded in the geography and political memory of the region. Borders, identities, and historical narratives across southeastern Europe continued to reflect the long period during which Ottoman rule and European resistance shaped the destiny of the continent's southeastern frontier. When historians look back on the long confrontation between the Ottoman Empire and the states of Europe, they often emphasize that the conflict lasted so long precisely because neither side existed in isolation from the other. Over centuries, the Ottoman Empire and the European world became deeply intertwined through diplomacy, warfare, trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Borders shifted many times, but the regions on both sides of those borders continued interacting in ways that shaped the development of societies across southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. The Balkans in particular became a space where imperial institutions, local traditions, and European political ideas constantly interacted. Cities such as Sarajevo, Belgrade, Thessaloniki, and Istanbul carried visible traces of these centuries of contact, from architecture and markets to legal traditions and patterns of urban life. The long war between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, therefore, did not produce a simple division between two completely separate civilizations. Instead, it created a shared historical landscape in which conflict and cooperation were often intertwined. This complexity also influenced how European powers understood their own political development. The presence of a powerful Ottoman Empire along the southeastern frontier forced European states to organize defenses, strengthen fortifications, and develop diplomatic strategies that could balance rival interests across the continent. The rise of alliances, the importance of fortified frontiers along the Danube, and the gradual evolution of professional standing armies were all shaped in part by the pressures created by Ottoman expansion. At the same time, Ottoman leaders observed the political and technological changes occurring in Europe, sometimes adopting new administrative practices or military methods as they attempted to preserve the strength of their empire. The result was a long process of mutual observation and adaptation. Even when armies confronted each other across battlefields, the political systems on both sides continued learning from the successes and failures of their rivals. Economic connections reinforced these relationships. Trade between Ottoman ports and European merchants continued across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, even during periods of conflict. Venetian and later French merchants maintained commercial privileges in Ottoman territories, while goods from Eastern markets moved through Ottoman-controlled routes into European cities. Grain from the Black Sea region, textiles from Anatolia, metals from Central Europe, and countless other commodities circulated through networks that linked Ottoman and European economies together. These exchanges remind us that the frontier between the empire and Europe was never simply a line separating enemies. It was also a zone where merchants, diplomats, travelers, and scholars moved between societies that remained connected despite their political rivalries. The legacy of this long relationship continues to shape the modern world. Many of the borders, national identities, and historical memories in southeastern Europe reflect centuries of interaction with the Ottoman imperial system. Some communities remember the period primarily through stories of resistance and independence, while others preserve traditions that developed during centuries of shared cultural life under Ottoman administration. The historical experience of the Balkans, therefore, cannot be understood without recognizing both aspects of this past: the conflicts that produced wars and uprisings, and the everyday interactions that linked societies across imperial boundaries. Looking back across these centuries, the long war between the Ottoman Empire and Europe appears less like a single continuous battle and more like an evolving relationship shaped by changing political realities. At different moments, the Ottomans advanced, the European powers resisted, alliances shifted, and entire regions were transformed. Yet through all of these changes, the two sides remained connected within the same historical system. The Ottoman Empire was never simply outside Europe, and Europe was never untouched by the presence of the empire along its southeastern frontier. Understanding this shared history helps explain why the legacy of that long struggle continues to influence how the region understands its past and its place in the world. If we step back and look across the entire span of this history, the long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the states of Europe begins to look very different from the simple stories of invasion or resistance that often appear in popular narratives. For nearly 6 centuries, the Ottoman state existed not as a distant outsider, but as one of the major political powers shaping the European world. Its armies fought along the Danube, its diplomats negotiated with European courts, its merchants traded in Mediterranean ports, and its capital at Istanbul stood at one of the most important crossroads of global commerce and culture. The empire was both a rival and a participant in the political system that connected Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Understanding this reality helps explain why the long conflict between the Ottomans and Europe never ended in the complete destruction of either side. The struggle persisted because both belonged to the same historical environment, influencing one another across centuries of war, negotiation, and exchange. Throughout the story we have followed, moments of dramatic conflict often appear to dominate the narrative. The crossing into Europe in the 14th century, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the victory at Mohacs in 1526, the siege of Vienna in 1683, and the later retreat of Ottoman power during the 19th century all stand out as turning points that shaped the course of history. Yet these events did not occur in isolation. Each was part of a much longer process in which political systems adapted to changing circumstances. The Ottoman Empire expanded because it developed institutions capable of governing diverse territories and sustaining powerful armies. European states survived because their own political structures evolved, producing new alliances, military reforms, and diplomatic strategies that prevented a single empire from dominating the entire continent. Over time, this interaction created a balance in which conflict and coexistence existed side by side. The regions that experience this long frontier struggle most directly with the lands of southeastern Europe. For generations, communities across the Balkans lived within a world shaped by the presence of the Ottoman Empire and the ambitions of neighboring European states. Fortresses guarded rivers and mountain passes, armies marched through fields that had been cultivated for centuries, and diplomats negotiated treaties that temporarily stabilized borders only for new wars to emerge later. Yet daily life continued amid these larger political struggles. Farmers planted crops, traders moved goods across markets, and families built lives in towns where different cultures and traditions met. These ordinary experiences remind us that history is rarely defined only by the actions of rulers and generals. It is also shaped by the countless individuals who lived within the systems those leaders created. In the end, the Ottoman Empire did not disappear because of a single defeat, nor did Europe achieve a final victory that ended the long relationship between them. Instead, the political world that had sustained both sides gradually transformed. New ideas about nationalism, modern states, and industrial power reshaped the international system in ways that the earlier empires could not easily adapt to. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman imperial structure dissolved, and the territories that had once formed its European frontier became part of a new map of independent nations. Yet the legacy of those centuries remained visible in architecture, language, cultural traditions, and historical memory across the region. The echoes of that long encounter continue to influence how Southeastern Europe understands its past and how different communities interpret the history of their shared lands. And so the story returns to the paradox with which it began. For centuries, Europeans described the Ottoman Empire as the great enemy at the gates of their civilization. Yet the deeper reality is that the empire and the European world were never truly separate. They fought wars, negotiated treaties, exchanged goods, and shaped each other's institutions for generations. The frontier that divided them was also the place where their histories became inseparable. Which leaves us with a final question that historians still debate today. If the Ottoman Empire was both Europe's rival and one of the forces that helped shape Europe itself, where exactly did the boundary between them ever truly exist?